Well, hello everyone, and welcome to my talk on an upgrade handbook to Rails 8. And welcome to Toronto. Welcome. Woo. Welcome to the largest city of the true north of almost 3 million people. And that's not including the greater Toronto area, as you can see here. This means that there's a lot of people and they need to get to a lot of different places. More than 600,000 rides on the Toronto subway, the TTC, occur on an average day. And you may have enjoyed a ride on these things in the city. In Toronto, we have 3 subway lines, which date back to the 1950s. And many people in the city, including myself, aren't super satisfied by the service. On average, the TTC records an annual average of 20,000 subway delays. That means there's over 50 per day, and only 14% of transit rides are considered on time. So you're going to be late everywhere. So why is the TTC so awful? Hold on to that thought. We'll get back to this. We're here to talk about Ruby on Rails and not the Toronto Rails here. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself. I'm Jenny. I'm one of the 3 million people that live in Toronto. And I'm also very experienced into running into subway closures and delays. I work at Shopify on the Rails infrastructure team, and Shopify being this city sponsor, there's a couple of us here, so don't be afraid to say hi. And we're also hosting the closing party at our office, so I hope you are hyped for that. And yes, get hyped! But speaking of hype, we're gonna cover some hype things, all about Ruby and Rails upgrades. We're going to touch on how to upgrade Rails in an application and its benefits. We're going to upgrade an app to the latest release. And I'll be talking about how Shopify mass upgrades Rails across the company. Here's the QR code for the slides if you want to follow along, but they'll be available at the end of the talk too. So how the heck does someone upgrade Rails in an application? The Rails Guide gives a great overview on how to upgrade a Rails app to the next minor version. I'll be doing a very quick walkthrough for those who aren't as familiar. There's some prerequisites before you start to upgrade Rails. And the first one is you need tests to prevent unexpected issues going into production. Tests are the first line of defense, which can tell you what parts of the app may need changing because of a change in Rails. Make sure you meet the minimum Ruby version required for Rails 8. That will be 3.1. And the first step of the actual process is to move to the latest patch version after your current version. So if you're on Rails 7.1.0, you will want to move to 7.1.4. You can do this by editing the version in your app's gem file and running bundle update. Then you will need to fix tests and deprecated features, and then you would move to the latest patch version of the next minor version by bundle updating again. So if you're on Rails 7.1.4, you would want to move to 7.2.1. Seems pretty straightforward so far, but that's not all. When you upgrade to a new major or minor version, you would need to run the update task bin Rails app update. This will help you with the creation of new files and changes of old files in an interactive session to update to the new templates and defaults. You may need to take some time to review the differences between overwritten files to see if that's something that should be kept for your app or not. And lastly, you'll want to configure framework defaults. One of the files the update task produces is the new framework defaults file. This includes many commented out configurations in which you would need to uncomment each one to make sure they work in your app. Once they are all uncommented, then you can update the load defaults to the latest minor. So here are the summary of the steps. It's not the most simple process, and it can take quite a bit of time if there's a lot of broken tests or deprecations. So why do we even bother to upgrade? Like upgrading to 8 if you're on Rails 7. Let's go back to why the TTC is so awful. One reason why there's so many delays currently is that there are reduced speed zones. This is because maintenance has neglected to a point where track repair is required in those areas, and it's just unsafe to go at a normal speed. And the busiest streetcar line in the city is closed from June this year to the end of year for track and electrical upgrades. And the replacement buses for them are a lot slower, especially during rush hour. The TTC lives by doing big repair and upgrade projects when they have to, and rely on quick Band-Aid fixes to keep on running. These upgrade projects causes more user dissatisfaction to an already poor rider experience. So what does better look like? In Japan, they are known for their efficient and reliable railways. They're reliable because they do maintenance and upgrades daily at night, keeping service on time and avoiding long periods of closure. To be a first-class city, the city's infrastructure needs to be first class. First-class cities tend to attract people, and they are happy because they can move around the city fast. Transit systems are just like Rails apps. If you don't upgrade Rails in your app and your version becomes end of life, you aren't getting backports of security and bug fixes in your app, and that's not keeping your app safe and up to date. It might be easier in the short term to rely on monkey patches or creating solutions to fix these bugs, but to a point, apps are forced to migrate due to one reason or another. This app in Rails 3.2, Heroku couldn't support it anymore, and this maintainer was worried that it's going to take super long and will cause many outages. And like previous releases, Rails 8 is going to be super exciting. You heard it from DHH himself. There's so many new features to continue making working in Rails 8 a first-class experience. This includes COML and solid queue by default, Rails LSP, dev container setup, and much more. And this all will attract more developers and very happy ones. So to summarize, why should you keep your Rails version up to date? So you're not going to be the TTC of Rails apps. You want to keep our Rails apps safe and reliable, prevent costly large upgrades, and promote a first-class dev experience. Now that we know how to do Rails upgrades and why they are important, I'm going to share some things that you may encounter while upgrading to Rails 8. The Rails 8 is going to be released or is released soon. Is already released, as DHH mentioned. But a lot of those features were also released in 7.2 in August. This includes default progressive web application files, dev container configuration, omakase rubocop rules, and many more. The deprecations in 7.2 will raise warnings and will be removed in Rails 8. So you're probably wondering, what deprecations are there? What should I expect to be removed? To make it a little bit more fun, we're going to upgrade an application from 7.1 to see what you can encounter in your apps. We'll explore some interesting deprecations and framework defaults so you'll know what to expect when you get your app one step closer to Rails 8. Before we get started, a little context on the app itself. I created an app that tracks TTC service alerts. It scrapes the TTC alerts on Mastodon, and you can see the posts in the app. And we can sort these posts by events, and you can see if they're resolved or not. And on the dashboard, you can see with the ongoing alerts and the current weather, I can determine if I should take the TTC or I should get an Uber to where I want to go. So the app is on 7.1.4. And when we upgrade to the next minor, there's some deprecations and changes when we run the tests. One thing you may run into is changes if you're extending your Rails console. To demonstrate this, I created a feeling lucky command that you'll never forget. I have a demo. I'll run it for you quickly now. Oh, okay. Whoa. This is dramatic.
Never gonna give you up. Never gonna let you down. Never gonna run around and desert you. Never gonna make you cry. Never gonna say goodbye. Never gonna tell a lie and hurt you.
Yeah, so it's a great command when you want to feel lucky, I guess. Anyways, how I do this is I extend the Rails console methods with the feeling lucky module. But in Rails 7.2, doing so in Rails 7.2 is now deprecated. This is because IRB introduced an official API to extend the console instead of hacking with internal parts of IRB. The API allows you to create helper methods and commands. A helper method should be used if you want to do an operation that returns a Ruby object, and while a command should be used for non-Ruby related things like utility operations and displaying information. So for my feeling lucky operation, I can define a IRB command with a category, description, and an execute method, and register it to my console. It now works, and it displays the category and description in the help menu. Rails has migrated to use this API, and some requires may also be deprecated if you're requiring them in your app or gem. So if you're requiring that helpers or app file, you should change them to require the methods file instead. Another change in 7.2 is that there was a change in active job queue adapter configuration. Previously, if you set a queue adapter, that adapter would be used in some tests, but in integration, action mailer, and active job tests, it will still use the test adapter. This caused weird behavior if you expected the application adapter in all your tests in previous versions of Rails. But in 7.2, the adapter is now consistent through all tests now. This may break a couple of tests if they were built around the test adapter though. So in this system test that uses assert enqueued with, it fails since the helper requires the test adapter. But you can set the adapter to test in the test config to easily fix this. In 7.2, when you run tests, Rails will now notify if a test doesn't have an assertion. This is pretty simple, but is very good since not having assertion can indicate if a test is broken. Like in this example, I want to test if a resolved event record has a resolution record associated. But if there's no events to begin with, then the cert is never reached and the test should be fixed. Sometimes you may have a test to make sure an operation doesn't error, like in this console test where I want to make sure that running the feeling lucky command um, doesn't explode when I run it. You can wrap a assert nothing raise to demonstrate this intent. The preference of enum syntax has also changed. And now there's a deprecation to using keyword arguments for using the name, using keyword arguments for the name and value. And Rails prefers you to use positional arguments instead. This syntax is better as it prevents requiring underscoring option args to separate enum definitions. And lastly, not really related to my app since it's on 7.1, but I want to call out that there's some last few deprecations regarding Rails secrets. Rails secrets is quite old. It was introduced in Rails 4.1, where you have a secrets.yaml file, and you can define secrets per environment. In 5.1, Rails introduced encrypted secrets, and when enabled and ran the setup command, it will generate a key along with an encrypted version of secrets.yaml. But in 5.2, DHH introduced a completely different name to secrets called credentials. It allows better secrets management by allowing different credentials files per environment. And Rails secrets have been deprecated since, and features are slowly being removed. In 7.2, read encrypted secrets configuration has been deprecated, and calling Rails application secrets have been removed completely. So this is the time to migrate to credentials by running the credentials edit command to get started. Okay, we're done with some fun deprecations and changes that you may run into. I'm going to quickly run through some notable file changes when you run the update command that I mentioned earlier. You'll get a suggestion to configure Puma Dev, which is the golden path to develop multiple Rails apps locally. And there's a change to the default Puma threads from 5 to 3. Through discussion and testing from Rails members, 3 threads had a good balance between throughput and latency. And now you'll see a new public view for unsupported browser template. As DHH mentioned in his keynote, in Rails 7.2, you can define what browsers your Rails app can support by setting Allow Browser in your application controller. Nice. Let's go through some new framework, some notable framework defaults when you run the Rails update command. There's a configuration to enqueue jobs after transaction commit. A common mistake with active job is that it'll enqueue jobs from inside a transaction, causing them to be ran before the transaction is committed, and that would cause weird errors. But now active job will automatically push enqueuing the job to after the transaction is committed and drop the job if the transaction is rolled back. And lastly, another default is that YJIT is enabled by default. YJIT is Ruby's JIT compiler that has been available since 3.1 and has shown to improve latency by 15 to 25%. So this is what some of the things you could expect on your upgrade journey. There's a lot of changes that I didn't have time to speak here, but hopefully you'll have a better understanding when you start your upgrade. Now I'm going to go through how Shopify is able to keep up with these Rails upgrades across the company. At Shopify, we have hundreds of Rails apps outside of our core monolith. This includes internal apps and other merchant-facing apps. This includes like an app that would allow merchants to sell bundles instead of individual products, and an app to help create logos for your business. These are, just to be clear, these are standalone apps and not microservices. A few years ago, we had 20 different Rails versions running on, we have 500 applications running on 20 different versions. With so many different versions, it makes it difficult to estimate upgrades across the company and get a handle of security issues from older releases. There was no expectations for apps to upgrade on a regular basis. As mentioned before, the more versions that an app is behind on, the harder it is to get them up to date. And for devs that wanted to upgrade their apps, the steps were a bit unclear to go through. Many just upgraded the ran bundle update without migrating the low defaults, and many told the team that was a painful process. So we got 2 areas of improvement. How can we make sure that all our apps are up to date, and how do we make Rails upgrades just easier for developers? For the first point, we introduced an upgrade calendar for Ruby and Rails upgrades. With the upgrade calendar, we can expect apps to run on the latest minor each year. For apps that fail to meet these expectations, we'll start a deletion process or escalate to create an upgrade plan for apps that we can't delete. This eliminates the ambiguity of when to upgrade and allows teams to plan for upgrades and allocate resources to do them. It also gives a good opportunity for teams to audit if their applications are still being used or if they're impactful. If it isn't, instead of proceeding with the upgrade, they can just start the archival process. For the second point, the more interesting point, how do we make Rails upgrades easier for developers? To make the steps clearer, we created an internal gem called Rails Upgrade. Remember the Rails upgrade guide mentioned in the beginning of the talk? This gem essentially is a command line script to automate each of the upgrade steps outlined in the Rails guide by running Rails upgrade once you install the gem. Then it'll figure out the next action that is required to upgrade your app, make the changes, and provide any context or follow-ups needed before the changes should be merged. The gem consists of steps similar to the steps of the Rails upgrade guide, and each step has a met and a meet method to determine if a step was already met already, and if not, meet will make the changes and commit it to the repo. So for the upgrade to the latest patch step, met will check if the version in the gem file log versus the patch version by fetching the Rails specs from Ruby gems. And for me, we have a version upgrader object that would update the gem file and run bundle update for Rails. One interesting step I like to call out is the auto-correcting deprecation steps. As we saw when we were upgrading 7.1 app, there were deprecations that could be solved by a simple syntax change or it could be deleted. Instead of wasting developers' time to manually fix them, we can statically auto-correct them. For example, a deprecation from 6.1 to replace URI parser to URI default parser. We can use the syntax tree to correctly identify if a constant URI that's calling parser and replace it with the default parser. This is an example of the output when you run Rails upgrade. It shows the steps being run and outputs the changes it committed. To leverage this gem, though, we hooked it up to a Rails application that we call Solid Track. It tracks all of Shopify's Rails apps and their versions, runs the Rails upgrade command, and opens PRs. And it does that on a weekly basis. This is what Solid Track looks like, and you can see the overview of the versions of Rails that's being run at that App Store on. And when you go on an app, go to an app page like Solid Track itself, since it's a Rails app, it shows when an upgrade run was called and the result. A run consists of a GitHub workflow that boots up the application and runs the Rails upgrade command. It takes the output and opens a PR. This makes it easier for developers to know exactly what to do to correctly upgrade their Rails app. If it looks good, they'll follow the steps and merge and ship the PR. So with the upgrade calendar, the Rails upgrade gem, and Solid Track, we now have 400 Rails applications, 100 less than what we had before, and they are all on 7.1 or later. And developers are grateful that Rails upgrades are simplified. So to recap, we have gone over the Rails upgrade process and why they are important, some fun things to look forward to fixing when upgrading your app to the latest version, and how Shopify upgrades at scale that you may want to take back to your company. But if there's one takeaway that, if there's one thing that you should take away from this talk, is to keep your Rails up to date. And this may be harder for earlier versions of Rails, but in the more recent versions, it's a lot easier to upgrade. So if you're on a really old version, spend that effort and it will get easier. As Eileen mentioned previously, if you're running on Rails 3.2, your problems are 10 years old, and you don't want to be the TTC of Rails apps. I'd like to thank everyone that helped to make Rails upgrades better at Shopify, and those who helped me with this talk, and happy upgrading. Here's how you can contact me, and slides, and feel free to come up to me and talk. Thank you.